We are hosting our final program in the Legacies of 1619 series, which will explore citizenship and belonging. I hope many of you have already seen some of our earlier programs, but if you have not, they will be available on our YouTube channel. Today we have a great panel, and I will introduce in just a moment, but before I do that, I would like to thank our co-sponsoring organizations, the Museum of African American History and Roxbury Community College. Today we will hear from, sort of going in order, skipping over Marita first, and then going to Manisha Sinha, who is a professor and the James L. Shirley A. Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut. She received her PhD from Columbia University, and her research interest lies in the United States history, especially the transnational histories of slavery and abolition, and the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction. Her most recent book is The Slave's Cause, which is really an amazing book if you haven't had the chance to see it. Next is Elizabeth Herbin-Triant, is a professor of history at UMass Lowell. She also received her PhD from Columbia University, and her research and teaching interests include African American history, particularly racial capitalism, urban history, slavery, and segregation. Her most recent book is Threatening Property, Race, Class, and Campaigns to Legislate Jim Crow Neighborhoods. Then Hasan Jeffries is a professor of history at Ohio State University and has the award for the furthest travel for today's program. He received his PhD from Duke University, and his research interests include civil rights and Black Power and the Black Power movement. His most recent book is Stealing Home, Ebbets Field, and Black Working Class Life in Post-Civil Rights New York. Finally, our discussion will be moderated today by Marita Rivero, who is the president and CEO of the Museum of African American History. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our panel.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Welcome. We're all eager to explore this issue. It really stands on themes that have been explored in the three other gatherings we've had in this series, Legacies of 1619. And I just say violence, for one, is fundamental to America's growth, and yet it's been erased kind of as a topic we bring into general conversation. That Native Americans and African Americans have been their own caretakers of their ancestors' records and stories. That both these and other groups have been observers of current news, its presentation of history, and sometimes the hypocrisy that's accompanied that presentation or is extant in books. Finally, we have an imperfect view which colors our current thinking. So much more personal research, willingness to be open, willingness to engage in further discussions about our history is an important step as we really think about the America we want to build together. I'm very happy to be here today, and we're going to take, I think, at first in 10-minute segments, kind of walk through history. We'll come back with a general discussion, and I'll then open the floor to questions and answers from the floor. Does that work? So let's begin with Manisha.
Thank you, Marita. Thank you, Gavin. Thank you, Catherine, and the Massachusetts Historical Society. It always feels like coming home. When I come here, I had a fellowship here a couple of years ago, and they haven't been able to get rid of me since then. But I'm really happy to talk about this topic of citizenship and belonging in the context of the Legacies of 1619, which we are marking in this year. And I'm a specialist of slavery and abolition, and when I think about the legacies of 1619, I ought to point out that the Black presence in the New World, of course, predated that moment. You had people of African descent coming with Spanish conquistadors to Florida, to the Southwest, all parts of the North American continent that became the United States of America. And of course, if you want to really start origin points, you could go right back to 1492, and you could talk about Columbus and the slave trade, and you could talk about how the first slave trade was actually the enslavement of Native Americans going back to Europe. But the point that I'm trying to make really here is that the history of the West at this time, including early modern Europe and America, has always been multiracial and multi-ethnic. It's just never been told in that manner. And so the starting off point, I think, when you think about the history of slavery, is to think about how all these founding moments involved Native Americans, people of African descent, later on, of course, even white indentured servants, people from Asia, various kinds of unfree labor. So when we think about citizenship and belonging, we have to think of all those masses of people who may not have enjoyed all the rights and privileges that came from being either colonists, first of all, and then as citizens of the early American Republic. The other point that I want to stress, and I'll go over this really fast because I have only 10 minutes, is that enslavement was always contested. That if you think of the American project, it's never been simply a story of oppression. There has always been resistance. There have always been people who have critiqued those conditions. They may not have been the most powerful, and they may not have gotten their way for a long time, but that they have always existed. So when I began writing my book of abolition, I really began with people of African descent in early modern Europe, but I also began with African resistance to the slave trade. I began with a woman who led a shipboard slave rebellion, who was instrumental in instigating that rebellion. We talk a lot about African participation in the slave trade. We hadn't really paid enough attention, I felt, to stories of resistance. And I argued that basically one should not differentiate between slave resistance and abolition. That slave resistance was not only the necessary precondition of abolition, but in fact it is the central story of abolition. Now, how is that so? I will go over this really fast with you. So you go back to the colonial era and you think of Quaker abolitionists, beginning from your left with John Woolman, in the middle Anthony Benezet, and then Benjamin Lay. These are just the three most outstanding Quaker abolitionists. There were a number of them, and a lot of them got involved in the revolutionary abolition movement, and they began some of the first abolition and manumission societies. They campaigned for abolition in the northern states, and in fact tried to ensure that black people and people of African descent, but even others who were caught up in slavery. I found cases of East Indian sailors in New York City who were caught up in slavery, and Native Americans, that somehow their rights would be respected in states that eventually became free. It was a long and gradual process. But what I want to emphasize is that even these early abolitionists did not think just that doing away with slavery was enough. They were talking about education. You can see Benezet there with black school children in the middle, as a path to citizenship, as a path to belonging. So this notion that somehow abolitionists just spoke against slavery, but they were all racial paternalists, was not really borne out by the historical record, at least not the ones who really campaigned for abolition, not those who just said things against slavery, but really did nothing to eliminate it, and in fact many of whom were slaveholders themselves, complicit in the institution. So I want to begin with looking at these early abolitionists, including African Americans who are campaigning for their freedom. Early black abolitionists may not have belonged to these societies, but they're crucial to the story of emancipation. So there, of course, is Elizabeth Freeman. That's an image of hers from the Massachusetts Historical Society. I think they have a better colored portrait of hers. Her suit against her slave owners actually propelled emancipation in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. There was another enslaved person by the name of Quaker Walker who was also involved. But I think she is important because, of course, she refers to her own enslavement in terms of the new state constitution of Massachusetts. So people of African descent are constantly referring to ideas of republicanism and citizenship, not merely to have it extended to themselves, but in fact as critics of that tradition, as engaging that tradition in a way that not just simply left them out, but in many times was based actually on their enslavement. There's, of course, Phyllis Wheatley and Olaudah Equiano. I don't have that much time to talk about them. Maybe I would at the question-answer session. Then I would talk about the early black abolitionists in what was really a slaveholding republic, because the US Constitution had certain constitutional protections for slavery. It didn't mention slavery or the word slaves, but you had the 3/5 clause, the Fugitive Slave Clause, and the clause that delayed the abolition of the African slave trade for nearly 10 years. And these men, James Forten, on your right, and in the middle, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, of course, they were the founders of the AME Church that was attacked in 2015 in Charleston, showing you that that was the church they built. The project was an abolitionist project. It was a project for equal rights and citizenship. And the fact that it was still attacked in 2015 shows you how the notion of black equality and citizenship has been fraught and runs like a red line throughout this country's history. I would go back to Walker's appeal in the 1820s too. He was a David Walker right here in Boston, black abolitionist. Many of you may have heard of him, but the important thing to remember about David Walker is that he again is kind of a founding critic of the American Republic. He criticizes Jefferson for his speculations on race. He takes him on, square and fair. He also rejects the program of colonization, which was this program to literally repatriate all free black people back to Africa. The rejection of colonization meant that the fight for citizenship would be right here in the American Republic. So the rejection of colonization is a very important step in moving the abolition movement towards making citizenship rights an important part of its program. And of course, the man most responsible for doing that in a way, in taking that program of black protest and making it a part of the abolition movement, was William Lloyd Garrison, again, Boston man. This is one of my favorite portraits of him because it is done by a black artist, Robert Douglas Jr., belonged to a black abolitionist family in Philadelphia. And the idea behind Garrison's paper was not so much of national citizenship, but looking at rejecting colonization. Garrison does come up with his own politics of human rights. And it's important for us to remember that. I think sometimes we forget how important that was a political platform for Garrison and not just a program of moral appeal. With that program of black citizenship went a rejection of racism, especially theoretical racism, and you can see this with Lydia Maria Child's famous pamphlet, An Appeal on Behalf of That Class of Americans Whom We Call Africans. It's not just a rejection of slavery, but of racism. What does that tell us for black abolitionists, especially the later generation of black abolitionists who were not northern born? Many of them, in fact, most of them pictured here, were fugitive slaves. You will recognize some, Tubman, Douglas. You may not recognize others like Pennington and William Wells Brown. But I think it's really important for us to think of this fugitive slave generation and think of fugitivity and citizenship. Because to be a black person and to be a fugitive, to be classed as a fugitive, Garrison refused to use the term, he called them self-emancipated slaves, is to constantly be under the threat of losing your freedom, losing everything that you have actually fought for. What's interesting, of course, is that this fugitive slave generation, particularly Douglas, takes this idea of fugitivity and turns it into an idea of belonging. His demand for citizenship, his insistence that America remake itself into an interracial democracy is what I think really makes a difference in terms of imagining black equality, imagining black citizenship in this country. Now, demanding citizenship did not mean accepting second-class citizenship. And there were a bunch of black abolitionists who posited an alternative to Douglas, and these were immigrationists. Now, we must distinguish between these immigrationists because they rejected colonization too. But they said black people should have the option to immigrate out of the slaveholding republic, especially in the 1850s, which kind of begins with the fugitive slave laws, ends with the Dred Scott decision. Things don't look so great. And you have immigrationism popping up amongst African Americans, that the fight for equality is not simply the acceptance of bad conditions within the United States, that the fight for citizenship could also be imagining a black nation and black independence. Martin Delany here in his Union Army uniform, Mary Ann Shadd Carey, a big proponent of immigration to the Canada West, and Henry Highland Garnet, who not only republished Walker's Appeal, but published his famous address to the slaves, asking them to basically leave slavery. But he was seen as provoking slave rebellion. He dies in Liberia as the US minister to Liberia after the Civil War. Finally, there's the question of gendered abolitionist feminists, and I'm really running out of time here, so I'm afraid I would not be able to talk too much about them. But I do want to say one thing about them, and that is that these women were intersectional feminists long before the rise of the suffrage movement. They didn't see much of a conflict between the fight for black rights and women's rights. So during Reconstruction, when you have the Reconstruction amendments that introduce the word male in the US Constitution and that enfranchise black men but not women, there are some white women who kind of leave this intersectionalism behind and appeal to actually racism in order to advance women's rights, which is highly problematic. But those were not those original abolitionist feminists, and that was another access in the demand for citizenship and belonging that is important to look at some of these original black and white women who made those demands. We end with Reconstruction when you did have an attempt to establish an interracial democracy in this country. And if you look at the 14th Amendment, Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, you know, there's so much jurisprudence based on this broad conception of equality. And I argue that this section really comes from abolitionist jurisprudence, from abolitionist imaginings of interracial democracy and black citizenship. So national birthright citizenship, something that Trump wants to do away with an executive order, but you really can't do away with a constitutional amendment through an executive order. Or the idea of due process of law and equality before the eyes of law. This is where you get the jurisprudence for the right to privacy, gay marriage. It's been used for all no discrimination on the basis of sex. The 14th Amendment has really let us think about American democracy and citizenship in the most expansive ways. Now, of course, Reconstruction is overthrown, but what I want to leave you with is this idea that that contestation that began with the establishment of slavery and then continued with the abolition movement never really went away. And that is a legacy that we should probably hold on to as much as we hold on to the legacies of enslavement coming out from 1619. Thank you for listening.
Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. The central question that Americans had to work out after the Civil War was one of great importance to both black and white people. It was this: what would the status of African Americans be? The nation would have to determine if black people would be equals to whites, enjoying political rights and access to economic opportunity, fully integrated into American society. Or would they be free in name only, kept under the control of the same people who had enslaved them? Or a third option: would they be allowed to enjoy some aspects of freedom but live as second-class citizens who could not vote or hold political office and who were kept separate from whites? African Americans wanted full equality. In a petition addressed to the Union Convention in Nashville on January 9, 1865, a number of black residents of Nashville expressed this. I quote, "We know the burdens of citizenship and are ready to bear them. We know the duties of the good citizen and are ready to perform them cheerfully, and would ask to be put in a position in which we can discharge them more effectually. We do not ask for the privilege of citizenship, wishing to shun the obligations imposed by it." These petitioners wanted to vote and serve in office. Being embraced as citizens would of course be ideal for African Americans, but it would also allow the nation to move toward meeting its own stated ideals. As the petitioners put it, this is not a democratic government if a numerous, law-abiding, industrious, and useful class of citizens, born and bred on the soil, are to be treated as aliens and enemies, as an inferior, degraded class who must have no voice in the government which they support, protect, and defend with all their heart, soul, mind, and body, both in peace and war. A few days later, a group of 20 black religious leaders explained their vision of freedom in an interview with General Sherman and the Secretary of War. Their spokesman was Garrison Frazier, a 67-year-old former slave and Baptist minister. Asked to state what you understand by slavery and the freedom that was to be given by the President's proclamation, the Emancipation Proclamation, Frazier explained that economic freedom was also central to black people. I'm quoting again. Slavery is receiving by irresistible power the work of another man, and not by his consent. The freedom, as I understand it, promised by the proclamation is taking us from under the yoke of bondage and placing us where we could reap the fruit of our own labor, take care of ourselves, and assist the government in maintaining our freedom. Frazier went on to explain that African Americans wanted to own their own farms and to enjoy autonomy in their work. African Americans had allies in government at this time, and the support of these allies for a conception of true freedom led to the adoption of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, which outlawed slavery and extended citizenship and voting rights to African Americans. Yet powerful Southerners opposed a meaningful freedom for black people and worked to undermine the Reconstruction Amendments at every turn. I wanted to talk today about what citizenship looked like for black people, particularly black Southerners during the age of Jim Crow. I'll focus on political and economic rights, two of the rights that the freed people most fervently desired. The story I'll tell is one in which African Americans staked a claim on political and economic rights, and white Southerners responded with a vicious backlash. For a couple of decades after the end of the Civil War, the Southern states granted African Americans some freedoms under which they flourished, gaining political offices and property. By the 1890s, however, laws establishing Jim Crow were put into office to stop these gains, and disfranchisement and segregation became widespread and deeply entrenched. After Reconstruction, Democratic elites again dominated the state legislatures, but their power was not without limit. Black and white Republicans controlled the so-called Black Second in North Carolina, for example, a district made up of 10 counties, mostly in the eastern part of the state, for nearly 3 decades. George Henry White, an African-American Republican, represented North Carolina's 2nd District in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1897 to 1901. An 1877 graduate of Howard University, White had previously served in various state-level offices, winning seats as a representative for Craven County in 1880 and a senator in 1884, then winning election as a prosecutor in the Black Second. In office, White fought against colleagues who sought to undercut the 15th Amendment and laws protecting black people's civil rights. The black majority wielded political power in the 2nd District until the state of North Carolina passed a disfranchisement amendment to the state constitution, which stripped African Americans of the right to vote in 1900. North Carolina used a poll tax and literacy test to do this. Other southern states used these methods as well as other ones to disenfranchise their black residents. In his famous 1901 farewell address to Congress, at which he acknowledged that he was the last African American to serve in a now all-white body, George White pointed out what black people had been able to achieve since the Reconstruction period. Forgive me for what's going to be a kind of long quote here. Since 32 years ago, we've reduced the illiteracy of the race at least 45%. We've written and published nearly 500 books. We have nearly 300 newspapers, 3 of which are dailies. We have now in practice over 2,000 lawyers and a corresponding number of doctors. We've accumulated over $12 million worth of school property and about $40 million worth of church property. We have about 140,000 farms and homes, valued in the neighborhood of $750 million, and personal property valued at about $170 million. We've raised about $11 million for educational purposes, and the property per capita for every colored man, woman, and child in the United States is estimated at $75. We're operating successfully several banks, commercial enterprises among our people in the Southland, including one silk mill and one cotton factory. We have 32,000 teachers in the schools of the country. We've built, with the aid of our friends, about 20,000 churches and support 7 colleges, 17 academies, 50 high schools, 5 law schools, 5 medical schools, and 25 theological seminaries. We have over 600,000 acres of land in the South alone. The cotton produced, mainly by black labor, has increased from 4.6 million bales in 1860 to 11 million in 1899. All of this we have done under the most adverse circumstances. These are a lot of economic gains, right? Dramatic for a group so recently in bondage. Democrats would present politically active African Americans, such as those in North Carolina's 2nd District, as a symbol of what they called Negro misrule, as they made the case for disenfranchisement. George White understood that the effort to push blacks out of politics was not really about blacks misusing their political power. Rather, the expansion of white supremacy during this period was a response to black political and economic success of the kind that George White just laid out for us. So this was a response to blacks doing their best to enjoy a robust citizenship. White people who sought to undermine political rights viewed African Americans as illegitimately participating in politics, thanks to an overweening federal government which had forced the Reconstruction Amendments upon the southern states, thus enfranchising black men against the wishes of the region's whites. They also, and this is particularly true of poor and middle-class whites, viewed blacks as competing with them for property and economic opportunity. Access to land and jobs was a zero-sum game, they believed. The more property blacks bought and jobs they took, the less would be available for white men. White men believed that these goods should be reserved for them exclusively. And as W.E.B. Du Bois explained it, they thought that whiteness is the ownership of the earth forever and ever. Even as poor and middling whites competed with blacks for access to land and jobs, elite white Southerners viewed blacks as a resource to exploit, labor that should be compensated poorly and could be discarded when no longer needed. White Southerners worked to shore up their own position above that of blacks to ensure that blacks were second-class citizens, not just through disfranchisement. Another pillar of the Jim Crow system was segregation. The southern states separated black and white people in public schools, cemeteries, trains, steamboats, and numerous other public accommodations. The segregation of public space served a number of purposes. As historians understand it, it worked to mark black and white people as different, and one as inferior to the other after the institution of slavery had ended. Historian Glenda Gilmore describes the segregation of public space as essential in reining in upwardly mobile blacks and keeping them in what whites called their place, a place defined by low social status, low income, inability to vote, and low expectations. As Gilmore put it, as a living testament to capability, successful African Americans' lives provided a perpetual affront to whites. The black lawyer, doctor, preacher, or teacher represented someone out of his or her place. The danger lay not in their numbers, but in the aspirations they inspired in their fellow African Americans and the proof they gave to the white lie of inherent African inferiority. Upwardly mobile African Americans presented what some whites considered a problem in the late 19th century. Troubled by the new experience of moving through public spaces alongside a generation of African Americans who'd never been enslaved and who often behaved like their social equals, whites looked to segregation to regulate behavior. Segregation was a way of creating order in a modern America, increasingly characterized by cities in which people were anonymous and their status unclear. Whether they were white or black was often difficult to determine as there was so much intermingling of the races. Talking about the cities, and also in addition to the more familiar spaces of the countryside, there's also this desire to create order. There's more to segregation than just marking one group as superior to the other. Segregation was also meant to help bring about disfranchisement. Wishing to prevent African Americans and their white allies from voting because they supported the Republican and populist parties, the Democratic leadership used segregation as a way of discouraging lower-class whites from aligning themselves with black voters. By branding black people as inferior, segregation was supposed to stop white people from forging political alliances with them. Segregation also boosted the self-regard of poor whites, though this wasn't necessarily the goal. Creating a hierarchy with one group permanently on the bottom also proved beneficial for employers. After the end of slavery, white Southerners attempted to replace slavery with other ways of controlling the labor of black people. They forced African Americans to sign labor contracts through the short-lived black codes. They terrorized and lynched thousands of black people, which worked to create a climate of fear that made sharecroppers and tenants less likely to fight against the terms of their labor, for example. Over time, they came to segregation, one effect of which was that it kept black people poor and lacking in opportunities, and thus more likely to accept low-paying agricultural and industrial jobs. When Robert Penn Warren asked him, "What are the white man's reasons for segregation?" one black man responded, "So the white man can have cheap labor, can make the money." Stuck in jobs that were relegated to people on the bottom tier with no prospects of advancement, African Americans were made a class of low-paid workers. An article in The Crisis from this period explains how this phenomenon works. African Americans may be placed in such positions as the white men in power choose for them, and may be paid such a wage as the same powerful white men deem suitable for a Negro. This has happened so often in the South as to be entirely familiar to every Southern colored laborer. The Southern Railway, for instance, has two scales of wages, one for its white and one for its colored workers. The latter, when doing the same work, receive only 2/3 of the amount received by the white employees. Colored waiters are a segregated group and receive a smaller wage than white also. Granted citizenship by the 14th Amendment, then, African Americans saw that citizenship become a meager shadow of the citizenship that white Americans enjoyed. Kept separate, blocked from economic opportunity, and prevented from voting, they would have to wait until the civil rights movement for more. Yet even today, African Americans still do not enjoy a fully equal citizenship. I'll point to two quick examples, one having to do with political rights and the other with economic rights, since those are the two things I'm focusing on today. The first one is voter suppression policies, particularly in the South, since the Supreme Court case Shelby County v. Holder, but also elsewhere, which limited blacks' access to the vote, and also discriminatory policies shaping where African Americans live. And here I'm thinking of the recent investigation that Newsday did on the real estate industry in Long Island. So if blacks are kept out of neighborhoods in which property values are rising, they lose access to an important source of wealth. As we think about the legacies of 1619, it's essential that we consider what we want citizenship to mean. For example, should it include access to political representation and economic opportunity? A robust citizenship entails equal opportunity for all, opportunity to be represented and to represent one's peers in office, and also to gain wealth and status. After 400 years, I think it's time that we embrace such a robust citizenship, such a robust conception of citizenship. Thank you.
Thank you very much and good afternoon. W.B. Du Bois, the African-American scholar, activist, when he was here in Boston at the turn of the 20th century as a student at Harvard University, he described that experience years later as being at but not of Harvard. When he was here as a student, he could attend class. He had whatever the equivalent of a student ID was at the time. He had his papers, if you will. But he did not belong. He said he was at but not of Harvard. I submit that from 1619 until the present, the black experience can be described as being at but not of America. African Americans have certainly been, have had citizenship rights reaffirmed by the 14th Amendment. but those citizenship rights have been contested. African Americans have had to fight for those citizenship rights, fight to secure them. Abolitionists, Massachusetts 54th, and African Americans since the Civil War, since the 14th Amendment, have had to fight to maintain those basic citizenship rights. That is the struggle through Jim Crow into the Civil Rights and Black Power era and through the present. So while these citizenship rights certainly have been more fully realized during the Civil Rights era than they had at any period before, while these citizenship rights for African Americans have been more fully realized now than they were 50 years before during the height of the Civil Rights Movement, they have never been fully secured. There's a difference between having the right enumerated on paper and actually being able to fully enjoy that basic right. I think today all you have to do is look at basic social and economic data points, as has already been pointed out, discrepancies and disparities based upon race in the criminal justice system, from the high rate of police-involved shootings to mass incarceration, voter suppression, and the like. It is no mystery that African Americans do not fully enjoy the same basic rights of citizenship that their white counterparts do. So African Americans have been here, we have been here as citizens, certainly for the last 150 years, recognized by the government. But we have been fighting to obtain and maintain those basic citizenship rights. So while African Americans, black folk, have had enumerated on paper citizenship rights, I will argue that they have never fully belonged because citizenship itself does not equal belonging, not in the larger society. And certainly not as long as the basic rights of citizenship are denied. And not even having a black president and having a black first family conferred a deep and lasting sense of belonging. I remember as a kid growing up, you always get asked this question in your classes, who is your favorite president? And I struggled as a child through the Reagan years to identify a favorite president. And I remember thinking when Barack Obama was elected, and it actually happened, because I didn't think it was going to happen, but when it actually happened, thinking, oh, actually, he hadn't done anything yet. I actually have a favorite president, right? Like, I can answer that question. I mean, that was a real thought, right? And I was like, oh, that's what this feels like, right? That was a sense of belonging that I had not felt before. But that, in itself, as good as the feeling as that was, that did not offset the persistence of injustice. That is why, when you get to that second term, you see bubbling up from young people across the nation the Black Lives Matter movement, because the sense of belonging wasn't there, even though we had an African American in the highest office in the land. So why has it been so hard to achieve belonging? We have to fight for citizenship, but belonging doesn't come along automatically. Why has it been so hard to achieve belonging? I submit that it has everything to do with slavery, and specifically what the rationale behind slavery was, which was white supremacy. Slavery is an economic institution designed to exploit African labor for profit, but the rationalization, the justification that's offered for it is white supremacy. And the principal legacy of slavery is white supremacy. And we have been living with that, certainly ever since the Civil War has ended. White supremacy is absolutely encoded in America's DNA. It is embedded in our founding documents, as Dr. Sinha was pointing out, in terms of the Constitution. It is embedded in the way in which we practice politics, even today, with our voting rights denials. It is embedded in our customs and mores and has always been. When we think about the post-slavery moment and the rise of Jim Crow and the legacy of Jim Crow that we live with today. So white supremacy is keeping black folk from belonging, enjoying that sense of belonging. Now this is a crucial point. What truth about this is revealed by the election of Donald Trump? What 2016 revealed and the last 3 years has confirmed is that there are a large segment of white Americans who continue to be animated by white supremacy. Now that shouldn't come as, looking at the last 3 years, as a surprise to too many people. But what may come as a surprise to many people when we honestly look back at the support that he received and what that election actually reveals, not that there's a large segment of white people who are animated by white supremacy, but that there's an even larger segment of white people who are okay with white supremacy, who are okay with it. Now, when 2016, the election was coming up, my students were asking me, who do you think is going to win? I was like, Hillary Clinton, it's not going to happen. I was underestimating not only how many people would be animated by white supremacy, but how many white people in America were okay with white supremacy. And for African Americans, when it comes to that sense of belonging, that is clear. I mean, the reason why black folk don't get behind Make America Great Again is because it's backward looking and not forward looking. And show me a time in the past, even yesterday, where black folk want to go back to. It's onward and forward always. It's been that way since 1619. It's like we got off the boat, we're like, all right, let's keep going. So you can be a part of a society. So where does this leave us? You can be a part of a society that doesn't see you as equal, can grant you citizenship rights, can put them on paper, but doesn't see you as equal. Du Bois being at but not of Harvard. But you won't necessarily belong to that society. You can be of that society. You can be at that society, but not necessarily of it. Black folk have understood this. But this sense of belonging is a deeply human need. People want to belong to the societies in which they live. And so black folks simply haven't, from 1619 to the present, been sitting around waiting and wishing and hoping white folk would be kind to them. They have responded. They have created belonging. And it hasn't been through assimilation. We often have that comparison. How come black people can't just be more like white immigrants and assimilate? Because assimilation is asking you to get rid of that which, in the American context for black folk, enabled them to survive. Their racial identity, their cultural heritage. So that is not an option. And integration isn't even an option when it comes to belonging, because integration as practiced, as we see coming out of the civil rights era, has been about an uneven exchange of resources. Black folk push integration in some quarters because that's the only way they can gain access to the resources that they need to live with a modicum of equality. We think about this when it comes to education in particular. Black parents want to send their kids to schools with white students. It's not because they think they're going to learn more sitting next to a white child. There's nothing magical. I don't know if y'all figured this out yet, but as a teacher I have. Ain't nothing magical about white children other than their ability to draw resources from the public, right? And so that is what integration was about. It wasn't about belonging or trying to sit next to white folk to generate this sense of belonging. Historically, the way in which African Americans have achieved belonging, search for belonging, has been by turning inward, by looking among themselves, by saying that the way we are going to have belonging is by drawing on the resources of the community. We see this expressed in immigrationism. We see this expressed in Garveyism. We see this expressed in black nationalism, and we see it expressed today in both conscious and unconscious ways. Why do black people, starting with the early AME church, begin to form their own churches, walk away from white churches? Because within the white church, there wasn't that sense of belonging. Within the black church, there is. Even if you got a white Jesus, but that's a separate topic. The sense of belonging. Why do black students, you hear this all the time, why do black students in ostensibly desegregated, integrated schools sit together in the cafeteria? The unconscious. Because they realize that this is that moment where they're able to come together and have a sense of belonging. I don't know if white folk know this, but y'all can be very exhausting. And even for young kids, they realize that it's so critically important to spend time together because that's what the belonging is. Historically, it's been that way, and we see it even now, in this very moment, with the rise in the number of applications and students who are applying to historically black colleges and universities. It is no accident that they have seen a surge in applications at a time when the general population, in terms of applications to colleges, is declining. And this did not happen during the Obama presidency. This has happened during the Trump presidency, as you have had this resurgence of hate. So historically, African Americans, even when they have secured basic citizenship rights on paper, haven't been able to enjoy this sense of belonging. That doesn't mean that they have been sitting on the outside waiting for somebody to open the door, but they have instead turned towards one another. And in understanding that and thinking about the black experience, that is so critically important, because that tells us, in his last word, that tells us that if we want to really understand that, if we want to really appreciate the African American experience from 1619 to present, we don't do it by pretending that we're colorblind. We don't fall into the colorblind trap, because that's actually saying, I don't recognize that which enabled you to get to this point. I don't recognize your need to belong to the group by being with the group. We want to be color conscious. We want to appreciate the cultural heritage that we describe as race, but that is really a substitute for cultural heritage that is among black folk. It's okay to recognize race. We just don't want you to discriminate us against black folk on the basis of race. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you to all of you. I think you brought out the point that resistance has walked hand in hand with development of this country from the very beginning. That there's been resistance on the other side in the form of laws being put in place to assist in segregation or in other ways to curb the full expression of citizenship in economic and political terms from African Americans. And you really bring us back to the notion of white supremacy and this idea that, and perhaps a kind of specific gift of slavery from the Western world. Obviously, Africans enslaved other Africans, but the question of whether or not you were intellectually inferior wasn't going to come up. You were not going to be a chattel slave for generations. So it was really the Western view of slavery as practiced in the United States that brought into play race in this way and the notions of inferiority that have somehow, as I hear you, underpinned really the full expression of citizenship. So I'm sitting here thinking about the this moment when we were asked to talk about who's an American. It seems to be a big question in people's heads as who is an American? And you're talking today about people who were working toward becoming Americans, who were part of what American is for centuries. Could you speak just a minute, the three of you, just your reflections on our, and certainly on belonging, where we found community, but on our possibility as a nation for discovering common humanity, or somehow moving in ways that allow us to escape that kind of terrible oppression of slavery, or are we in fact going to become a nation of communities, of smaller communities that belong? Where does your your sense of history lead you as you contemplate our future?
So I really think that when we think about belonging in the nation, because that's what we talk about, the nation state, right? That we tell the story of American democracy as a contested one. You know, when President Obama was elected, one did feel that sense that somehow this country had taken a turn. There were even people who were so euphoric, they said, oh, racism is dead now, and race is dead. Well, of course, we know that that was somewhat of a naive prediction, right? But when Trump is elected, it felt like the fall of Reconstruction. I think I wrote a piece called, like, said, it feels like the fall of Reconstruction. Because, you know, if you think about Reconstruction and then the period that Betsy is talking about, Jim Crow, you know, how do you go from, you know, former slaves, you know, defining their freedom and in the process redefining American democracy to, you know, racial terror, lynching, segregation, debt peonage, convict lease labor. You know, how does it happen that we have these moments where we seem to break through and then you regress so quickly? And I would argue that, you know, the old narrative of this kind of linear progress of American freedom just expanding is obviously too simple and highly inaccurate. But I think we need to bring back this notion of contestation, that the democratic project in the United States has always been contested. How come these white supremacists, as Betsy also pointed out, are the ones who want to, you know, fiddle with the Voting Rights Act? Why are they so anti-democratic? You know, the people who are staunch believers in racism are also undemocratic people. And I think they actually are a problem for American democracy today. Look at our complete violation of democratic governance in the Constitution with impunity. You know, I'm not a big person always appealing to the law and the Constitution, but I now think about it that the fabric of democracy in this country is challenged, and it comes back to this question of black belonging, because the story of black slavery and black freedom is also the story of American democracy and how it has been contested and redefined.
I may be giving kind of a similar answer to the one that Manisha just gave, but to answer this question of how do we create a sense of belonging for all, which is how I heard your question, I think that it's essential that we have a history that's taught to students that tells a story in which the expansion of rights to more and more groups is a story of the nation moving toward meeting its founding ideals, right? That this isn't a story of, you know, unpatriotic Americans who are sort of pushing for their own agenda, but rather that this is what the country is about, right? That this is supposed to be a country in which, you know, people of all creeds and colors can come together and belong, and that, you know, as we expand rights to encompass, you know, all different groups, that is the story of America.
One of the things that is so, I think, important to this sense of creating belonging is being able to recognize the humanity in other people, see the humanity in people who do not look like you, do not come from the same places as you do. I was talking to a teacher not too long ago, and the teacher was complaining that the students in her class would show no compassion when it came to discussions and showing images of kids on the border being locked away in cages. And she was trying to have this discussion, and they just had these sort of blank faces and blank stares. And she said she came to the conclusion that the children of this generation just simply have no compassion. And I said, no, I said, actually, they're very compassionate. I said, I don't think it's a question of them not having compassion. They just don't have compassion for these people. I said, next time you go to class, show them some images of some dogs who have been abused, and tell me what their reaction is. And she did. And she said they were almost in tears. We teach our children to have more compassion for animals than we do for children of color. And we cannot create a sense of belonging, a sense of inclusiveness, as long as we are teaching children, we are teaching ourselves to not be compassionate.
So I'm going to, I know I'm right at 5 o'clock, and I'm going to ask you a quickie, flash, and I do, if you wouldn't mind, maybe 10 minutes, if there are questions in the audience, I might hear 3 of them, and we'll try to answer them all at once. Just what's your case for history, for people understanding our history in getting to compassion? Is there a case you'd like to make in all of you, and this is your field? This is the flash question now.
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, a case in terms of pointics or something?
Well,
or the
my
need for-
mother said that history is the skeleton inside a living country.
Yeah, yeah.
It should be true. And so I just like, this is your field.
Yeah.
Is your field going to have something to do with helping us
No,
reach a different space?
absolutely.
That's what I'm asking all of you.
I hope so. And one thing I know that we can't do, and one thing I think we have to be very clear about, and this points to something that Dr. Sinha just said, and that is that white supremacy is inherently undemocratic. And you can't be a democratic white supremacist. And if that's the case, then what have we been working with? We should not be surprised that our nation has put a greater emphasis on exclusion than inclusion if we have white supremacy encoded in our DNA. So one of the lessons of the past that history can tell us is like, we can't get caught up in this myth of inclusion and belonging as though we've had it, because we haven't. We've been working toward it, and we still have a long way to go. So I think one of the things that history can do is dispel the myths about the past that then make us complicit about the present.
Okay.
So my answer would be that people aren't necessarily moved by numbers, right? If you just tell them, the number of Africans who came over during the transatlantic slave trade, or the number of people who died en route, the numbers don't really reach them, right? But storytelling is something that history does offer that I think really does tug at heartstrings, right? So when you can tell a story about an individual and that person's dreams for his or her future, and what that person did to meet the dreams, I think we can tell these stories that people can connect with, and I think that that's a way of building compassion, right? Is telling the story of a person, making it, I hate this term, relatable, right? But making that story something that others can relate to and connect with. Here's someone of a different time period and color, et cetera, yet familiar, right, in their humanity. So I think that's a great thing that history does offer.
I would totally think that, history is the most important lesson. Absolutely. We are thinking of something like national birthright citizenship. Why is it coming up again? Because of the problem in the borders. Or even if you think of something like human rights, abolitionists coined that term, seeing the humanity in others, empathy. All that. I mean, just the story of slavery and abolition, I think, can tell us a story of American democracy that will make us better citizens today. So absolutely, history is essential.
All right. I wonder whether I might just, are there some questions here? Do I see some hands? All right, we can't manage all of this. So why don't we just quickly get the question on the floor? Can we get your questions on the floor very quickly? And then we'll try to do what we can as a group.
To develop a sense of belonging. But then when we look at the 14th Amendment, where we're establishing at last a national citizenship, the local then turns against black people, because through the next 50, 100 years, where local institutions withdrew those rights from black people that the 14th Amendment had supposedly established on a national basis. So when you talk about belonging, we're a republic, and the idea is behind a republic is that we accommodate both the local and the national. How do you fit that in today then? Where does this belonging start locally? Do we want a national sense of belonging? That's for all three of you, but put.
Get another question on the floor. Let's get it. Okay.
My name is Ivy Jack. One question I have is, I've read the 1619 Project, gone to many events. I think this is wonderful and fabulous. But then my question is always, so what next? And that's my question for all of you. What next? Like, what is happening? What should happen? What does that even look like?
My name's Renee. I've been to 1619 too. And my question is about the Supreme Court and how their thoughts of incorporating our rights when we get Republicans on there. Mind you, I don't feel that it's just Republicans. I go across the board really just saying white people, because if you're at a job, you're not thinking, if I lost that job and it was done racistly, was that a Democrat or was that a Republican? I'm not thinking that. I'm thinking, you know, strictly that. You know, it's a white person that did that to me. And so I'm wondering, through the law, you know, get past to where we know that you're a segregatist. You got there. But how can we remove them to a degree? And then also the other thing is, how do these people, when we fight against, you know, when they say, okay, you took my seat into college, you know, I scored higher than a black person, they'll say. But it's like, excuse me, you scored higher than a white person too. And there's no such thing as someone, you know, getting my grades, and you know me, knowing that I scored higher than a white person too. So how is it that it's always against someone of color?
Just to jump off the what next question, there was sort of two competing articles that came out recently about plantation houses. One from the Knot saying that they'll no longer advertise wedding destinations for plantation homes, and the other was saying that exit surveys by visitors to museums that were plantation homes found that they were talking too much about slavery and the black experience. So in terms of the what next, how do we push through the resistance when people are willfully ignoring the humanity and sort of the experiences of black people within the context of the plantation home or within slavery?
Okay. Is that, got it? I think you're the last question, that hand back there. And I think we've got...
Thank you. I wanted to amend the last speaker's comment to say that what we really have to deal with is white male supremacy. And I wonder if expanding the view that way leads to any constructive paths forward.
Okay. So we've got a list. Are we all ready here, folks? We've got everything from pop culture. We've got tensions between local and national citizenry issues. Who's in charge? We've got a couple of what next. 1619. How plantation homes, how the story is being told. White males. I'm going to let you have at it. Okay. We've got about 12 minutes.
Popular culture. You go from Gone with the Wind to 12 Years a Slave. And I think it is important for history to make those interventions. I mean, I started writing op-eds. Who knew Andrew Johnson would be back in fashion, right? So it is important, not just popular culture, but mainstream media, local and national. I think it's really important to establish national citizenship, because we've seen how states, especially those with the legacy of long-lasting slavery, have used states' rights to discriminate, this anti-big government. They began that with the Freedmen's Bureau and Reconstruction, and that continues. So that undemocratic, seeing the state, now it's called the deep state. First was big government, before that was, you know, the federal government and federal tyranny. But it's in many iterations, it's the same undemocratic project. Affirmative action, there's been affirmative action for white people in this country for like hundreds of years. So it's about time we open up institutions to others. What do we do from here? I really think we need active citizenship. I love Betsy's notion of robust citizenship, because it is a matter of belonging, but it is also a matter of actually going out there and making the difference, going to those museum sites and putting down your comments on why it is important for the project, for the unending experiment of American democratic republicanism to understand the history of slavery and its legacies?
Who wants to go next?
Sure. I'm still putting my thoughts together.
On the power and role of popular culture, I think it is, we live in a very important moment now where, as was just said, we've gone from not only Gone with the Wind, but Birth of a Nation to 12 Years a Slave. And, you know, films like Ava DuVernay's When They See Us, I've used that in the classroom. I teach a class, actually, African American history through film, and I show that in the classroom, and it's powerful, and that's not the only one, Fruitvale Station. And what it does is it's able to get students, people, to connect. We talked about compassion, but to have empathy, to connect, and to see the value in the lives of other people who traditionally are devalued in the larger society. So that medium of popular culture, whether it's a movie, a film, a documentary, a novel, a book, is wonderful to get students to feel other people's experience. So I think it plays a central role, a valuable role in teaching. And that's part of what is, to jump around a little bit, part of what is what's next. I mean, we're all teachers here. And so, you know, part of the what can be done next is, well, what do you do now? Students often ask me, well, tell me, Dr. Jeffries, what should I do? I was like, I don't know what you should do. What do you want to do? The good thing about inequality in America is it's across the board. So whatever area a person has a particular passion for, I'm a teacher, but I'm the son of social workers. I didn't go into social work, I went into teaching. My brother's a lawyer, he went into politics, right? I mean, so there's whatever area you have a particular passion for, I think that's where your energy is needed. But it's part of the education, because you just can't go in not knowing. You have to study up, you have to learn, you have to go in and then be effective in that way. The question of the sort of what to do with the Supreme Court or sort of these admissions and stuff, white privilege is real, but often white privilege in the minds of those who enjoy that privilege view it as or understand it as white guarantee. Right? There's a difference between white privilege and a white guarantee. If you're white, you're not guaranteed success. You're guaranteed you have the privilege of not having to deal with some of the BS that people of color have to deal with, but that is no guarantee. But that is too often read as, well, I'm supposed to get in. I'm supposed to get this job. So that's not really a black problem. We just suffer the consequences of it. That's a white problem. Like, white people need to deal with that in their own minds and get over that. Now, we can help them. That's what. But that's not a problem in the white mind. The white male supremacy, I accept the friendly amendment, but at the same time, you know, we can't let white women off the hook. You know, sort of patriarchy is an absolute problem. White male supremacy is a problem, but white supremacy itself is something that is not gender specific. So it's important that we bring that's part of the conversation. But I take your point. Look, I'm very much of the mind, and I said, look, we would all be, when it comes to, certainly in the realm of voting, we would all be better off if we just let black women do all the voting. Just turn it over. Everybody else just sit back and just let them handle it.
Betsy, I think he's turning the floor over to you.
Hey, right. And just hand. So wait, just one last, before I give up my voting rights to you. The question of plantation homes, this is also an education thing. I mean, this is also, so after 1619, what do we do? We're educators. It's interesting because the plantations that, plantation homes, and I've been doing some work at some historic sites, are seeing a decline in visitorship, in part because they are trying to tell a more truthful and accurate history, some more so than others. You can't talk about a plantation home without talking about the children who were enslaved, who are making the bricks that go in. I mean, you literally can't, right? Oh, okay. On my part. I mean, I just came a long way. So No, literally this last one. But we see that, and this is the power of the truth. The power of the truth is that a place like the Whitney Plantation in Louisiana that is telling this honest, hard history has not seen their visitorship go down. They've seen their visitorship go up. So telling the truth, you will lose some, but you will also gain many more if you do it honestly and forthrightly, because there's a real desire and hunger for the truth since it's been denied for so long. I yield the floor.
Add a couple of comments to what I thought were pretty comprehensive comments here. The first one on pop culture. Yes, I think that pop culture helps people with empathy. Also, this is the way to reach the general public, really, about history, right? And I'm thinking of, I think, if I'm remembering this correctly, right, there's a quotation by D.W. Griffith of Birth of a Nation fame, right, where he says that one day people aren't even going to read history books. They're going to go into some booth and just watch a film, you know, like Birth of a Nation and get their history there. I mean, that's my nightmare. But you know, a lot of people do that. So we do need pop culture that is accurate and that people can connect with. Another comment, let's see, about the tension between local and national citizenship. You know, I think it's no surprise, right, that African Americans in their, you know, to the extent that they have felt a sense of belonging, it's been to the federal government, right, since Reconstruction. And, you know, in my research, I've looked at these local ordinances setting up residential segregation, you know, all these towns using their police power to segregate neighborhoods. I mean, if you live in a place like this, you know, of course people aren't going to feel a sense of belonging if, you know, if their local, the town that they live in is segregating the places that they live in. So yeah, it's essential that the federal government stand up and be the thing that protects these fundamental rights. And I think that's part of why this administration has been so troubling, right? It's because there had been this sense of security that the federal government was on the side of, you know, a broader justice, et cetera, and now that's really feeling threatened. Maybe I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Good place to leave it. Thank you so much to the panel. Thank you. Thank you all.